talk, our next speaker, who is actually joining us from France. Well, I'm looking back, but you will see in the front if you look online, but that's Christophe Martinsons from Grenoble, and he will speak about our work on sustainability, performance, health, and smart lighting. And he will especially look at the health aspects and the big study we've been doing, which is about to be published in maybe a month's time from now. And that's a major achievement of the third term, which we're just now, well, we just closed it, but the study is kind of hanging on for the fourth term. So, Christophe, I'll give you the floor, please.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you, everyone. And I'm very proud to be here with you. And I really wish I could attend live. It was not possible, unfortunately. So let me share my screen and I'll present you what we've done as far as health is concerned. Okay. Just could you confirm that the video is fine and the sharing works? I can't hear.
Yeah, yes, it is. We can see it and we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, so this work is a review of health effects, and it's a collaborative work carried out by several authors all over the world. So myself for France, Jennifer Veitch for Canada, Sarah Loughran from Australia, Ashley Nixon from Canada too, and Rohan Mate, Rachel Harris, and Linda Chen from Australia, from Monash University for Rachel and Linda. So it's a work that we've done, we've started, when did we start? 3 years ago, 2021, actually. Okay. Okay, so it's a work that is very important because the objective is to see if there's a problem or anything that can go wrong with solid state lighting for humans. So health is defined by the World Health Organization as a state of complete physical well-being, mental and social. It's not simply the absence of disease or infirmity. So that's why in this work, we examined not only hardcore health issues, but also psychological outcomes, such as mood, the way you think, cognition, and other soft aspects, but they are really important. So the objective of this report is to study the health impacts on people, solid state lighting, and we look at the general population, but we are also concerned with sensitive groups, sensitive populations that may exist with regard to some specific aspects of solid state lighting, blue light, temporal light modulation, things like this. Some people can get very sensitive to this. The objective is really to help governments to set up policies and guidance for avoiding any kind of undesirable effects that would prevent solid state lighting to achieve all the potential we know for energy saving and reducing the environmental impacts. It has to be accepted by people. It has to be good for people. Otherwise, all these energy savings and good benefits will be lost. That was a problem that you probably all remember with fluorescent lamps and compact fluorescents, for instance. So we worked on lamps and luminaires, both consumer and commercial, for indoor and outdoor lighting. And the idea was highlighting risk that could emerge if sometimes products were incorrectly used by consumers. And as I said, providing guidance to sensitive population. So what this work does not do is to specify lighting design choices. It's really another field. Lighting design is for lighting designers, and we are addressing products, so manufacturers, regulators, standard organizations, but not the people who actually design lighting installations. And we don't consider what can go wrong during manufacturing or installation of those products. We look at the general public. Products out of scope are automotive lighting and light sources that are not lighting products. So the toys, the portable lamps, displays, and so on. The methodology was inspired by what we did for the first health report of this D4E SSL annex at the time. It was published 10 years ago. And we are updating this report by a thorough literature review that everything, including everything that was published between 2015 and 2021, because we started in 2021. And we we added additional papers during all the time we had to finalize the report. So between 2021 and now, basically, we added some information from the latest research. And as Neil said, the new report is expected to be published next month. So these are the different chapters that are addressed in the report and in this talk. So let's move on to photobiological safety. So there will be a lot of text. Unfortunately, it's a summary of a report, but don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat, and we'll talk about it later. Photobiological safety. Well, if you think of photobiology, it's everything about light and human beings, living organisms, let's say, including humans. But for standards and regulations, photobiological safety includes the direct effects of light, optical radiations, because it also concerns UV and infrared. So direct effects of light on the skin and the eye. And those effects in this category, they can happen very quickly, from less than a second for a burn, for example, in front of a very powerful source, to about a workday, let's say 8 hours. So there are several risks that are described in photobiological safety standards. But for solid state lighting products, we just have to deal with the blue light hazard. It's the only photobiological hazard that is relevant for this category of products. And the blue light hazard is something happening in the retina, and it's caused by the short wavelength light, blue and violet light. And there's an interaction between those photons and some cells in the retina. And it actually produces cell death in the retina. So both the photoreceptors can die if they have too much exposure to short wavelength light, or other cells. And it all depends on the exposure dose. So it's a matter of retinal irradiance, what is actually incident on the retina, multiplied by the exposure time. And all this is well known and covered in standards. So for example, the 62471, which defines risk groups. And it's also included in regulations. For example, in Europe, in the low voltage directive, we have to comply with product safety standards, and photobiological safety is treated in the same way as electrical safety or thermal safety. There are limits not to exceed. So we have risk groups for photobiological safety and restrictions. For example, consumer products should be no risk or low risk, risk group 0 or risk group 1. A conclusion of our review is that there is no consensus between the lighting community and people working on the retina, so biologists and ophthalmologists, because a lot of research emerged those last 10 to 15 years. And it was found that retinal damage caused to blue light can happen below the existing limit. And the existing limit is used to define the risk groups. The lighting community doesn't see any problem because nobody is blind all of a sudden using consumer products, for example. But retinal experts are really concerned. And So one of the conclusions of our work is, since there is no consensus, there should be a systematic review and update of the fundamental limits for the blue light hazard, because we have now modern detection techniques. We have many, I would say several independent teams working on different animal models and even human retinas. And they found some good results that motivate a systematic review and update of these limits. We have, at the moment, risk groups that are currently defined only for the general population, because they are determined using the exposure limit that I was telling you about, but also by the spectral sensitivity curve of the adult population and not sensitive population, including children. And there is actually another sensitivity curve for sensitive populations. And the big difference between those two sensitivity curves happens before, I would say, for the shortest wavelengths. So between 380 nanometers to 430 nanometers in blue-violet light. It's a spectral range where you have a greater sensitivity of sensitive populations. And we don't really know what products emit in this spectral range, especially those violet pumped LEDs and new technologies of LEDs that may emit in this spectral range. So we need more measurement data. We have a lot of measurements data for common white LED and colored LED products. But for these specific technologies, we don't have data. The research that we examined revealed the circadian aspect of retinal phototoxicity. It happens that the retina is more sensitive at night. So people who are exposed at night to solid-state lighting products should be more careful. I mean, the products should be selected more carefully, maybe with a risk group that is below what would be normally prescribed, for instance. So now let's move on to discomfort glare. It's really a source of complaint because it's a bad experience that you can get from lighting products in general. Discomfort glare, it causes discomfort without necessarily impairing the vision of objects. So you can actually see, maintain some good vision, but you are bothered by high luminance contrasts. And when your eyes is adapted to a certain luminance, or a certain level, I would say, if you have a bright object in your field of view, it's not comfortable to look at. So it's called discomfort glare, and it's always very difficult to quantify. It's not directly influenced by the absolute quantity of light, but by the contrast with the surrounding and the background. And in central vision, where you can perceive all the details of the light source that is glaring, then there's a really high sensitivity to the edges and the borders and all the features that are contrasted, actually. So the design of the product can be fundamental. The physiological mechanisms contributing to discomfort glare are not fully understood. Discomfort glare is often measured using psychological methods, subjective assessment scales. But now we have more research on using physiological sensors and biophysical sensors, such as eye trackings or EEC, to correlate physical measurements with the sensation of discomfort glare. So when, as far as solid-state lighting products are concerned, in indoor lighting, we have a lot of large area uniform sources. For example, those LED panels that we often find in offices. And intrinsically, they have a lower luminance and less glare than what would happen with smaller sources with the same luminous flux. So if you have a larger area, you tend to spread out the flux and have a luminance that is smaller. So that's good. And you can use established glare indices to assess discomfort glare. UGR works very well. Now you also have SSL lamps and luminaires that are non-uniform, and this is not good for discomfort glare. So it was really well studied in research. And the CIE defined a correction to apply to the UGR to correctly assess discomfort glare for non-uniform sources. If you have, for example, an LED panel with discrete LEDs, it's much worse than having a uniform source, much worse because of many borders and contrasting edges, as we said before. Now, when we look at outdoor lighting, outdoor SSL products used at night, they don't seem to produce more discomfort glare than older luminaires. But all the research that was investigating studied that from a distance where the source appeared to be very small, like a point source. And the actual effect of non-uniformity in street and road lighting luminaires has not been very well studied. And this non-uniformity becomes visible at close distances. And there's no study really on this subject. So that should be done in the future to see how people react to those non-uniform sources outdoors. For the spectrum, traditionally, if you look at the established glare indices for discomfort glare, such as UGR, there's no influence of the color of the spectrum. In reality, it's something else. We know now that when we have a high proportion of short wavelength light, blue light, we have more discomfort glare than for other tints. Lower CCT, warm white, is always perceived less glary as high CCTs. The role of the spectral distribution in discomfort glare is not really known to a full extent. We have correlations with CCT, but there are many possible spectral distributions for a single CCT, and it's really difficult to have an action spectrum, I would say, a sensitivity curve for discomfort glare, spectral curve. So there are some models that were published in the literature describing the spectral dependency of discomfort glare, but there's no standards yet, and CIE hasn't come to a consensus for this. Now, glare can have indirect effects. So glare is not good in itself, but when you are exposed to discomfort glare, it can trigger and aggravate headaches, and particularly in people suffering from migraines. We have empirical evidence of a link between visual discomfort and some neural responses measured by different techniques. And we have two contributions, really, a visual contribution associated with high luminance contrast and also spatial frequency in the visual fields. Patterns, such as my shirts here, are very, very bad for discomfort. Well, for comfort. It really creates discomfort at certain spatial frequencies. But we also have non-visual pathways, and it's not very well known yet, but it has been demonstrated in a few research papers. And it seems to involve pain receptors and pain modulators, and directly linked with the aversive or painful response to glare, mostly in sensitive people. And we don't really know the influence of the spectral distribution of light. Young people are more sensitive to discomfort glare, and very quickly. On the other side, elderly people are also sensitive to discomfort glare, but they react after the exposure. And after being exposed to a glaring source, they may experience a decrease in visual performance. It has been shown in several papers. And also, it's not surprising that there's probably a link between the circadian rhythm and discomfort glare. It seems to vary along the day. So you are most susceptible to discomfort glare in the morning, and apparently there are several stream of publications on these subjects. It decreases along the day. So there's still a lot to be studied in this field, but it's not constant and uniform. We are humans and related to a lot of other aspects regulated by the biological clock, and we'll talk about it a little later. So Temporal light modulation, another big chapter of this health report. Temporal light modulation, we saw the presentations before. It's a variation in the light output, periodic or non-periodic, but it's a temporal variation of light output. And it's actually seen as noise by the brain because it's, even if you don't perceive it, photoreceptors can detect this temporal light modulation and pass signals to the visual cortex. Some individuals are more sensitive to this than others. In terms of the highest frequency that you can detect, it could be called fusion frequency, but fusion frequency is for flicker, not for TLM in general, but it's the analog. You can detect some TLM at higher frequencies when you are sensitive. We don't really know who those people are, but we know how to test them. There are tests, and every time a team does an assessment or a study of temporal light modulation, we know how to identify, and we do get a fraction of the population, or at least of our sample, that is more sensitive, much more sensitive than others. So for the brain, temporal light modulation is noise. It makes neural computations more difficult, increasing fatigue and contributing to eye strain. And it's also known that TLM, temporal light modulation, can cause epileptic seizures or migraine headaches. For vision, it's also not very good to have temporal light modulation because even if you don't have flicker, you can see stroboscopic effects if you move your hands in front of a lamp with too much temporal light modulation. And you can also see the phantom array effect, which is a visual effect happening when you move your eyes quickly in front of a modulated source. It's really a bother when you see that everywhere if you move your eyes from left to right, especially at night in the dark, and you see a decomposition of the source or multiple sources that are not real, of course, they are phantom images. And it's really a problem in automotive lighting, so it's not in the scope of our report, but also lighting when it is used in dark environments, when it is dimmed down, you have pulse width modulation with a very short duty cycle, and you can see this phantom array effect very well. A lot of people see it, and it's a bother. We don't have metrics yet, but many promising research papers. And so we are hopeful that in the next few years, we'll have limit values, a metric and a limit. Temporal light modulation is a perturbator for the normal course of the eyes when reading, for example. It has been showed by Arnold Wilkins and others from the 80s, the 1980s, that when you have modulated light in special frequencies of the worst frequencies being 100 hertz and 50 hertz at the time for the old video displays. And it's really now well demonstrated with eye trackers that the reading performance is altered under modulated light. So we still don't know everything about temporal light modulation. We don't have all the quantities yet. And even for the quantities that we have, SVM, PSTLM, it's not easy to measure, as we saw previously. And for the phantom array effect and other more complicated effects, such as migraines, it's difficult to build a proper metric. So a general good idea, precautionary principle, would be to reduce temporal light modulation as much as possible. Noting that TLM, temporal light modulation, is not always consciously perceptible. Sensitive people can be exposed without knowing it, actually, because it is not necessarily associated with something visual, like the stroboscopic effect of flicker. Okay, let's move to the circadian effects. Circadian effects. We have an internal body clock that is synchronized almost to 24 hours, but not 24 hours And that's why light is important, because light is the strongest cue that the body has to regulate and synchronize our internal body clock to 24 hours. So it has important implications for lighting and health, because if you get light exposure at inappropriate times or insufficient amounts, you can have perturbation in your circadian rhythm with many outcomes as far as sleep is concerned, and appetite, mood, and so on.
Christophe, you need to start rounding off a little bit.
Okay, so we have a metric from the CIE to quantify this, the MEDI, which works very well. And artificial lighting can, it's proven now, disrupt the circadian system. So we have to be very careful to when we are exposed and what is the levels. So we have now established that there is an effect of light exposure on sleep, and you can have a lot of details in the report, but sleep is quantified by the quality of sleep and the quantity of sleep. And if you look into details, the slow wave sleep is much affected by disruption of the circadian rhythms due to improper light exposure. And we have absolute effects of light exposure everywhere in metabolic functions. So there are some sensitive populations to circadian disruptions due to lighting. Again, children are included in those populations, but also elderly people. Light exposure, okay, sleep, okay. What we can recommend, and it's now quite accepted in a community of lighting and sleep specialists, is to reduce the exposure to short wavelengths of light at night or in the day, in the evening, and on the contrary, to promote the exposure to short wavelengths in the morning. And when you are exposed to those short wavelengths in the morning, you can have beneficial effects by decreasing the sensitivity of the circadian rhythm to light in the evening. So it's a counterbalancing effect. It's very interesting. Some populations may require different lighting conditions to optimize their circadian rhythms and sleeps. Again, sensitive populations, older people, shift workers are really exposed to circadian disruptions. And it's not clear yet whether they need to be lighted differently, I would say. We have the last category of effects now, acute neuro-behavioural effects. So it's really close or maybe associated with circadian effects. It's mediated by the intrinsically photoreceptive retinal ganglion cells, the cells that are directly connected to the biological clock of the brain. And we find the same relevant parameters, intensity, timing, and so on. There are many, many studies, and it's very difficult to have conclusive results. So that's why there are more and more dosimetric studies to examine how the real exposure of people influence those outcomes, because it's really difficult to test in the lab. We have a spectrum, an effect of the spectrum, and it's very difficult to know what the best spectrum is. And inter-individual differences, chronotype, age, culture, there's also a lot of social factors, such as behaviors. We have international recommendations to regulate, let's say, those outcomes and to minimize. So a healthy dose of melanopic light, 200 lux of melanopic EDI at the eye during the day, which seems to be very difficult to reach in most office situations. So we don't know for how long we need to maintain those conditions. It's actually a research problem. And if we manage to reach those 250 lux of melanopic EDI, we know that we will be badly considered by the energy people because we'll overconsume for lighting. It's a big risk, actually, a conflict between energy codes and melanopic requirements or circadian requirements. Long-term effects, I will skip these because there's nothing critical, and jump to the conclusion where we identified 3 areas where SSL products need to be examined carefully. We need further examinations of issues related to the blue light hazard for sensitive populations and most especially children. We need to consider the risk of discomfort that arise from ways in which some SSL products are designed and used. So this can be targeted at both the manufacturers, so they don't make uncomfortable products, and at consumers, so they don't put them in their homes, for example. Typically a really highly non-uniform LED source that will be very, very at risk of discomfort glare. And the third area is temporal light modulation, where we need to develop new quantities and establish new limits to reduce risk to individuals. Regulations need to be tightened because at the moment we have SVM and PSTLM in the EU eco-design regulation, which is very good, but the limits only apply to products at full power. And we know that the critical risk of temporal light modulation happens when you dim a product, especially an LED. So when products are not used at full power, that's where we have problems, and regulations should cover this issue. And a few useful messages before concluding. So we have to make the public aware that we need bright day and dark night. It has nothing to do with SSL products, but SSL solid state lighting can really ruin that. So we need to be aware of that individually to adapt our behaviors with respect to lighting. We need to focus on populations who can't access daylight because daylight is the most important source of exposure, and it should be because it's healthy. And if you think of hospitals or prisons, those people can be exposed to daylight. So we should make an effort and try to manage their exposure and to make it better. We should promote daylight time at school. And I think we are late in Europe because the Asian countries really considered that in respect to the myopia problems that they encounter. And we should explore lighting design, technology and controls interactions to enable to deliver higher light exposures by day without too much increasing the energy use. So to solve the apparent conflict that we have between a good light exposure, but a high energy use. And that's it. And I thank you for your attention. And this is the name of the contributors of this report. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christophe. We are a bit over time now, but if we have any few short questions, please let us know.
Niels, could I just mention, Christophe, there are 6 questions in the Q&A. As a panelist, I think you can view those, yeah?
Yes.
Yes, and if you can type your answers, if you click on the blue button, you can type an answer. So,
Okay.
so you can answer them written, and that will save us time, and we can...
Can we pick one and do it orally so we can hear what it is? That
okay,
would be nice.
No problem. So during the next speech, I will type an answer. But the first one is, how do you define sensitive population for blue light? Well, the first sensitive population is people with retinal disease. So since the elderly people have a high chance of developing age-related macular degeneration, for instance, or other retinal pathologies, glaucomas, things like this, they are very sensitive to blue light. The young kids are very sensitive because their crystalline lens is very transparent and their eyes is smaller, so you get more light on the retina for the same illuminance on the cornea, the outside of the eye. It's an example of sensitive populations. What do we have here? Consider first.
Take one more quick, Orly, and then we'll
one
go
more
to the next.
and then, okay. Has anyone considered the effect of the phantom array in street lighting affecting the depth perception between the driver and stationary moving obstacle? It's a good question. I haven't seen that in our review. I don't think that was addressed in the research that was published. But it's a good question because when you see the phantom array, you are really puzzled. It's a cause of distraction because you see multiple images. And I wouldn't be surprised. So I think it's a good research hypothesis to state that there might be an effect on the 3D perception, because with moving objects, you don't really know where the object is if you have a multiplicity of images. So I think it's a good question, but I don't have the answer.
Okay, Christophe, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And again, it's a pity not having you here on site, but next time I hope
sorry.
we'll meet you again. So brilliant. So